They told her she was a fool, a once-in-a-lifetime seat gone, handed over to a total stranger. But Ellie Harper didn't blink. She saw what no one else dared to notice. And that moment, that single impossible choice, would return to her like a thunderclap months later, when armored trucks rolled up her forgotten driveway, and strangers began rebuilding her shattered life. Curious? You should be. Ellie Harper stood at the edge of her family's withering farmland, in the quiet hills of Kentucky, the morning fog coiling between fence posts like lazy spirits. Beyond the last rusted gate, the two-lane highway twisted off into an unknown world, a place she'd only dared to dream about. Her boots sank gently into the wet soil as she leaned against the cracked wood, a chipped coffee mug warming her fingers. At 30 years old, she'd never left the shadow of these hills. Her whole world was this patchy land, a time-worn relic left behind by her parents, and the dusty Sunday market where she sold jars of blackberry preserves and baskets of bruised peaches. She didn't resent it, not entirely. There was honesty in tending stubborn fields, in knowing the rhythm of the roosters and the silence of frost before it crept in. Still, on sleepless nights under a sea of stars, Ellie yearned for something else, anything that stretched beyond cornrows and feed bills. She dreamed of oceans that vanished into mist, of cities where lights never slept and mountains that made the sky look small. Travel? That was a fairy tale. The farm barely broke even. She patched the barn roof herself with scavenged tin and duct tape. The tractor drank oil like a dying beast, and groceries came after feed bills were paid. Flights, hotels, vacations, they belonged to other people in other worlds. Until the envelope arrived. Thick, cream-colored, addressed in a familiar script that made her breath catch. Ellie's rough fingers tore it open, and out slid a wedding invitation from Naomi Brenner, her old college roommate. One of the few who hadn't disappeared after Ellie left school to save the family land, Naomi was getting married in Portland. But the shock didn't end there. Tucked inside was a printed plane ticket confirmation booked with Naomi's travel miles. At the bottom of the invitation, scrawled in Naomi's unmistakable confidence, "I'm not taking no for an answer. You're coming, Ellie. It's time you saw the world." Ellie held the ticket for nearly an hour, letting its meaning settle over her like dust. She'd have to find someone to watch the goats, figure out airport rules, maybe even buy something that wasn't denim. But under all the anxiety, something stirred a flicker of reckless hope. Maybe, just maybe. 2 weeks later, Ellie stood inside a cramped regional airport, her boarding pass clutched like a lifeline. Her best jeans were freshly laundered, her flannel shirt neatly ironed, and her scuffed boots gleamed with polish. Everything around her was loud, fast, strange, the overhead voice barking codes, blinking boards that made no sense, people rushing with roller bags and espresso cups. At her gate, she found a seat by the window and watched the metal birds roll down the runway. She felt completely out of place and completely alive. "Excuse me, miss. Mind if I sit here?" Ellie turned to see an older man easing toward her, leaning heavily on a dented aluminum cane. His leg didn't bend right, and his fingers clasping the cane were scarred and gnarled like storm-warped wood. A faded military cap sat low on his brow, the emblem frayed with age. "Of course," Ellie said gently, sliding her bag aside. He nodded, saying nothing more as he lowered himself slowly. Around them, people shifted, just barely but enough. Some avoided his gaze entirely. Others glanced sideways at his injuries and quickly looked away. Ellie knew that silence. It was the same empty hush that had filled her home during her father's final days, when cancer had taken everything but his breath. She gave the old man a soft smile. After a moment, he offered a nod of gratitude, the smallest lift at the corner of his mouth beneath his cap's shadow. The boarding call echoed. "Flight 419 to Portland now boarding." Ellie rose, brushed off her jeans, and checked her pass. Group 3. As she stepped forward, an airline attendant tapped her shoulder. "Miss Harper, you've been selected for a complimentary upgrade today. First class." Ellie blinked. "Me?" The woman smiled. "Positive. Enjoy your flight." As she stepped into the velvet-roped line, Ellie felt like a stowaway in someone else's life. "First class? It felt absurd. She clutched the boarding pass tighter and looked back just in time to see the elderly man struggling to hoist his battered duffel over his shoulder, moving slowly toward the coach section. Middle seat. Cramped. 14 hours in the sky. She stared at her ticket. Then she turned. "Excuse me, sir?" she called, weaving back through the boarding crowd. The man paused, confused. Would you like to take my seat?" His brow furrowed. I couldn't." "Please," Ellie said firmly, holding out the pass. "You've earned more comfort than most people ever will." Whispers fluttered around them. The line shifted. The man looked at her for a long, quiet second, and in his eyes, something cracked, pride warring with exhaustion, gratitude breaking through. He took the ticket with fingers that trembled just slightly. "Thank you," he said, voice low and thick with emotion that had nothing to do with age. Ellie smiled. "Enjoy the flight, sir." As he made his way toward the first-class cabin, Ellie slid into the back of the plane. It was cramped, loud, and cold, but her chest felt strangely lighter, as if something important had just shifted. She had no idea this tiny act would change her life in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. Not yet. The seat in front of her was closer than it had any right to be. As the aircraft filled up, the air grew stuffy thick with recycled air. The sharp scent of jet fuel and the collective restlessness of too many souls squashed into too little space. Ellie Harper shifted in her cramped row, her knees already protesting the lack of room. The dream of first-class luxury was evaporating fast. Maybe giving up that seat had been a mistake. But when she leaned just enough to peer ahead past the heads bobbing in fidgety discomfort, she caught sight of the veteran again. He was settled now into a plush leather seat near the front of the cabin. A flight attendant was bent at the waist, speaking gently to him. She smiled, not the brittle, obligatory kind, but warm and unforced. Jonah Briggs, if that was really his name, looked like he wasn't sure how he'd landed there. His scarred hands gripped the armrests, as if afraid they might disappear. Ellie smiled faintly. Maybe, just maybe not, all good deeds vanished into the void. The flight felt like an endurance trial. 14 hours is a long stretch even in first class. In economy, it was a slow-motion test of sanity. The man beside her fell asleep mid-snore, mouth agape like a startled frog. Across the aisle, a child repeatedly dropped a tablet onto the floor, every thud slicing through Ellie's thoughts. The food was beige. The coffee was barely sentient. The bathroom? Ellie had scaled less daunting sheds back on the farm. And still, she didn't mind. Not really, because somewhere up in first class, a man who had seen things no one should see was finally getting a sliver of peace. She thought about him, about the invisible weight he must carry, the battles that had left no medals, and how one spontaneous act had sliced through the monotony of a long, impersonal day. Midway through the flight, Ellie stretched her stiff legs with a slow walk toward the rear galley. As she passed the velvet curtain of first class, her gaze flicked sideways. There he was again, awake, not resting, not reading, just staring out at the vast nothingness beyond the glass. His shoulders had relaxed slightly. The guard was down. Their eyes met for a moment, a brief flicker. Nothing more. But this time, his nod wasn't gratitude. It was respect. Mutual, wordless understanding. Ellie returned the nod, the corner of her mouth twitching upward, and continued on. When the wheels finally kissed the tarmac in Portland, the cabin erupted with the usual chaos of tired travelers desperate to be anywhere but in their seats. The veteran disappeared into the crowd of carry-ons and clattering luggage carts. Ellie never saw him again. In the blur of reunion hugs, flight connections, and the sprawl of a terminal that felt like a city, he vanished. She thought, just for a second, that she should have asked his name. But maybe some moments weren't meant to be stretched. Maybe their magic came from their brevity. Naomi's wedding was a small miracle tucked into a vineyard, like something out of a dream. It was the kind of day that felt curated by the universe, sunlight, laced through rows of green vines, string lights strung like stars, and soft jazz drifting through the air like a secret. Ellie laughed, danced, clinked glasses with strangers who hugged her like old friends. She breathed in the lilacs, let the wind play with her borrowed dress, and for the first time in years, let go of the invisible list she always carried in her head: repairs. feed orders, overdue bills. And when she boarded the return flight, crammed back into economy class with aching knees and a cramped back, she didn't care at all. The adventure had been worth every jolt of turbulence. Life, as it tends to do, settled back into its familiar grooves. Early mornings, endless chores, the soft rhythm of hooves in the barn, and the quiet rustle of seed packets in spring. The memory of the wounded veteran, the gift of a seat, became just another thread in the quiet tapestry of her life, a warm one, but no longer sharp at the edges. She didn't expect it to return. She didn't need it to. She'd already gotten her reward, a taste of something bigger, and the simple joy of doing right without waiting for applause. Which is why, on a storm-bitten Saturday, when she woke to the unmistakable roar of engines grinding down her old gravel road, Ellie thought it was probably the Miller boys joyriding again. She pulled on her jacket and muttered about teenage testosterone, already picturing muddy donuts carved into her pasture. But when she stepped outside, the wind stole her breath. It wasn't pickup trucks. It was a convoy. 3 olive-green Humvees rolled to a precise stop at the end of her drive, military boots crunching gravel as men in crisp uniforms fanned out. A sleek black SUV with government plates idled behind them, the dust curling up in ghostly spirals around its tires. And stepping out of the lead Humvee just as calm and composed as if he'd rehearsed, it was the man she never thought she'd see again. Jonah Briggs. Only now, he wasn't slumped and scarred in worn civvies. Now he stood tall, in full army dress blues, gleaming medals aligned across his chest like silent declarations. His limp was still there, subtle, but real. But everything else? Commanding, grounded, whole. He smiled as their eyes met, slow, honest, and somehow younger than it had been at the airport. Ellie felt like the earth dropped beneath her boots. She stumbled down the porch steps, her heart pounding so hard it muffled the wind. I don't understand, she managed, blinking like a woman who'd wandered into the wrong story. But somehow, she did understand. The story was just beginning again. Before she could reach the gravel, Jonah stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the tight stitching of his uniform, the mirror shine of his boots, the metals catching the pale morning light like starlight caught in metal. Miss Harper, he said, his voice warm and solid. It's good to see you again. Ellie opened her mouth to answer, but her voice got lost somewhere between disbelief and awe. Behind him, the soldiers stood like an honor guard pulled straight from a movie. It was surreal. She blinked again, but nothing changed. Jonah's smile turned faintly mischievous. You look about as surprised as I was, he said, a chuckle buried beneath his words. Finally, Ellie found her voice, barely. I really don't get it. What is this? Jonah stepped aside and motioned toward the SUV. A man in a sharp suit, hair cropped short and an earpiece glinting in the breeze, strode toward her with military precision, in his hands, a thick envelope. He handed it to her with a respectful nod, then turned and retreated like a ghost, disappearing into fog. Ellie turned the envelope over. Her name was scrawled across the front in careful, looping script. Miss Ellie Harper. She opened it with hesitant fingers. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, stamped with a golden army crest. Certificate of Recognition. For an act of uncommon humanity and compassion, shown to a veteran of the United States Armed Forces. The Department of the Army hereby extends its deepest gratitude to Miss Ellie Harper. Her selfless action embodies the very spirit of dignity, respect, and kindness that every soldier fights to preserve. Presented by Colonel Jonah Briggs, 3rd Special Forces Group, Airborne. Ellie read it once, then again, eyes wide. Twice decorated. Not just any soldier, not just some injured traveler. Colonel Jonah Briggs wasn't simply the man Ellie Harper gave her seat. He had once led one of the Army's most elite special operations units. She looked up at him, speechless, her thoughts crashing like waves. He raised a hand, almost bashfully. You had no idea who I was, he said, smiling softly, and that's exactly why it meant something. Behind him, a few of the soldiers were unloading something heavy from the back of a Humvee. Ellie heard the metallic scrape of gear, followed by the unmistakable thump of wood hitting earth. Her eyes narrowed. "What? What are they doing?" she asked, voice thin with disbelief. Jonah's smile curved into something closer to mischief. "We brought you something," he said. "Actually, a few somethings." She stared, wide-eyed, as two soldiers carried a large wooden crate toward her porch. Others unrolled fencing wire, hauled out tools, and stacked lumber like they were gearing up for a full-blown mission. "What is this?" she asked again, firmer this time. Jonah turned to her, shoulders squared, his voice quiet but resolute. "You gave me dignity when I felt like a shadow," he said. "You gave up something valuable, a moment of comfort. You could have clung to for someone who didn't expect it and hadn't earned it from you." Ellie shook her head, overwhelmed. "It was just a seat." "It wasn't," Jonah said gently. "Not to me." He stepped closer, dropping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I was flying back from a long rehab program in Portland. Burn recovery. Surgery after surgery. For months I felt more like a puzzle missing half its pieces than a person. People stared, or worse didn't. I was invisible, until you looked right at me." Ellie swallowed hard. There were no words. The wind shifted, cold on her cheeks, a lone crow calling somewhere in the distance. Jonah's voice lifted, a brightness sneaking in. "So, we figured, maybe we could return the favor, just a little." He nodded toward the construction materials now rapidly overtaking her front yard. "We're rebuilding your barn." Ellie's breath caught. Jonah smiled. "One of my guys owns a contracting company now. When I told the unit what happened, they volunteered, took vacation days, flew in on their own time. This wasn't an order. They wanted to do this not just for me, for you." She turned to the barn, her father's barn, the same one that had half collapsed during that brutal spring storm. She'd patched it stubbornly, board by board, but it had long outpaced her skill and her wallet. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, voice cracking like thin ice. "We want to," Jonah replied softly but firmly. The day exploded into organized chaos. Soldiers swarmed the farm like a finely tuned machine. They measured, sawed, drilled, nailed, and lifted with military precision. Posts were replaced, beams realigned, fences restrung. Tools hummed and laughter rang through the air like music from a past life. For the first time in years, the farm felt alive. As Ellie brought out a pitcher of lemonade, she found herself beside Jonah, both watching the crew with quiet admiration. "You really didn't have to do all this," she said, glancing sideways at him. Jonah grinned. "And you didn't have to give up your seat." Her throat tightened. She smiled, nodding. "Fair enough." They stood in that golden hush of late afternoon, two people tethered by nothing more than a shared moment and a chain reaction of compassion neither could have predicted. Somewhere between strangers and friends, standing in a life neither of them would have imagined days earlier. The sun dipped low, gilding the fields in amber as Jonah turned to her once more. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small, battered coin and gently placed it in her hand. "This is a challenge coin," he explained. "We pass them between soldiers to honor loyalty, valor, brotherhood." Ellie turned it over. On one side was the emblem of the 3rd Special Forces Group. On the other, deeds, not words. "It's not given lightly," Jonas said, "and almost never to civilians." Ellie blinked rapidly, her fingers closing around the coin like it might vanish. I don't know what to say." "You already said it," Jonah replied, "when you saw me." And in that moment, it all clicked. Kindness wasn't small. It wasn't a footnote or a throwaway gesture. It was everything. It bridged gaps no one could see. It repaired the unspoken. It restored what we didn't even know we had lost. And sometimes, just sometimes, Sit brought an army convoy rolling up your driveway. By dusk, the barn stood tall again, its beams straight, its paint fresh and proud. It looked like something off a postcard, now not. The tired skeleton Ellie had nearly surrendered to time. The whole place seemed brighter, not just the land, but something inside her. As the soldiers began packing up their tools, returning the grounds to peace, Jonah approached her one final time. "We'll be heading out soon," he said. His voice held something Ellie couldn't quite name, maybe a whisper of reluctance, maybe something gentler. She nodded, unable to trust her voice just yet. And then he paused. "There's one more thing," Jonah said again, this time pulling a slim manila folder from inside his coat. Ellie took it with a questioning glance. Inside, a neatly typed letter on Department of Veterans Affairs letterhead and a check. Her breath caught. "Jonah, what is this?" she asked, stunned. "The team chipped in," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Part of it's from the Veterans Support Fund. The rest, that's from us. We wanted to make sure the farm stays yours." Ellie's knees nearly gave out. The amount was enough to erase the back taxes she'd been secretly drowning in. Enough to fix the house, replace the tractor, hire, help, maybe even breathe again. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was gratitude, pure and simple. The convoy pulled away just before sunset, the engines fading into the hum of cicadas and distant wind. Ellie stood at the edge of the drive, the check still gripped in her fingers, watching until the last vehicle disappeared into the trees. She clutched the folder to her chest, overwhelmed. I don't even know." Jonah offered her that soft, knowing smile. "Then don't say anything," he murmured. "Just promise me you'll keep growing things here." Ellie laughed, tears spilling freely. "That, Colonel Briggs, I can promise." The convoy pulled away just before sunset, the engines fading into the hum of cicadas and distant wind. Ellie stood at the edge of the drive, the check still gripped in her fingers, watching until the last vehicle disappeared into the trees. For a long moment, she didn't move. The cool breeze touched her cheeks. The sky stretched overhead, vast and quiet. They had seen the convoy, but only she knew the story behind it. And the best part? It wasn't over yet. The farm felt different now, bigger somehow, brighter. The next morning, Ellie Harper rose with the sun like always. Old rhythms die hard. She fed the hens, watered the garden, hauled buckets to the horses. But the air carried something new, a weight lifted, a quiet joy threading through her every step. That afternoon, she walked into town with a crate of produce for the Saturday market. But long before she reached the stalls, the change moved ahead of her, like a whisper riding a warm breeze. People noticed. They'd seen the convoy. They'd heard murmurs. Some had even glimpsed the olive-green Humvees idling outside her old gate. Landry, the grizzled hardware store owner, tipped his cap to her with unexpected tenderness. Mrs. Hanley, the no-nonsense librarian, placed a basket of blueberry muffins in Ellie's arms without a word. Even old Mr. Holloway, who hadn't uttered more than a grunt in 10 years, said as she passed, "Quiet strength, that's what you are." Ellie didn't explain, not out of secrecy, but because some parts of a miracle were meant to live quietly in your chest, untouched, unsaid. A week later, a letter arrived. Not from an office, not official at all. It was scribbled in thick, blocky handwriting on plain notebook paper. No pretense, just truth. "Dear Ellie, I've been thinking about that day on the plane, about how something so small can change a man. When I came home broken, I didn't just lose muscle or skin. I lost belief in people, in meaning, in myself. You handed me back more than a seat. You gave me back faith. Sometimes, that kind of rescue means more than any battlefield ever could. Stay stubborn. Stay kind. Keep growing things. And if you're ever near Fort Bragg, there's always a chair at my table. Respectfully, Jonah Briggs." Ellie folded the letter with shaking hands and placed it in a wooden box by her bedside, tucked beside her father's pocket knife and the tiny stone heart her mother had carved. Things too precious to lose. That night, with the windows open to the cool Georgia air, Ellie stared at the stars. Somewhere out there, a man she barely knew yet, somehow knew completely, was carrying her kindness forward. And she in turn would keep planting. In her fields. In strangers. In the fierce, unshakable hope that a single moment of compassion could still shift the world on its axis. The seasons turned, as they always did. Summer slid gently into autumn. Her fields flushed gold beneath the soft sun. Pumpkins fattened on their vines. The old apple trees her father once tended bore fruit redder and sweeter than she remembered. The scent of soil and wood smoke curled through the air. But it wasn't just another harvest. Ellie Harper's land wasn't merely surviving anymore. It was thriving. The barn new, strong, painted in rich scarlet stood proudly in the center of it all. Its doors wide. Inside, gleaming tools hung in neat rows. Hay stacked high, livestock fat and content. The roof didn't leak. The fences didn't sag. The past had been patched with steel and sweat and generosity. And something deeper had shifted, something unspoken between her and her town. Folks who used to pass with nothing more than a polite nod now slowed their trucks to wave, or pulled in just to say hello. Some dropped off worn-out tools, spare parts, buckets of paint, jars of jam. Nothing big, but everything meant. Ellie wasn't the quiet farm girl anymore. She had become something else. A reminder, perhaps, that kindness planted well will always bloom sometimes when you least expect it. She started small. A wooden box beside her produce stand at the market. A handwritten sign. Take what you need. Pay what you can. At first, she worried. Would people take advantage? But the opposite happened. One morning, she found a warm loaf of bread left beside her eggs. Another day, a folded scrap of paper. You helped my cousin when he came home from overseas. Thank you. And every Saturday, without fail, a small envelope appeared beneath her apples. Inside, $20. Always $20. No name, no message. Just a steady, quiet answer to her quiet, stubborn hope. Ellie never tried to learn who left it. Some mysteries, she realized, were best left unsolved, wrapped in grace and faith. As the first hard frost crept over her fields one November night, Ellie walked out into the open air. Her boots crunched on the silver grass. She paused in the middle of her land, eyes closed, letting the sharp air fill her lungs. It wasn't about the barn. It wasn't about the check or the medals or even the memory of a uniformed stranger at her porch. It was about what had taken root: hope. That Christmas, Ellie mailed out her very first holiday cards, hand-drawn sketches of her snow-covered barn, her horses peeking from their stalls. One went to Naomi's friend who had given her the plane ticket that started it all. One went to the Veterans Fund, unsigned. And one went to Colonel Jonah Briggs. Inside she wrote, "Dear Jonah, the farm is still standing. So am I. The seeds you helped plant, kindness, faith, stubbornness, they're growing strong here. You once told me not every rescue happens on the battlefield. You were right. Sometimes it happens in a shared smile, in a wordless nod, in a moment no one else saw but us. A seat offered, a barn rebuilt, a life changed. Wherever you are, I hope you're still growing things too. Merry Christmas, Colonel. Always, Ellie." She sealed the envelope, stepped into the chill, and dropped it into the mailbox at the edge of her drive. The wind caught her breath and scattered it skyward, like smoke. She didn't need a reply. Some conversations echo without words. Spring would come again. The fields would bloom, the soil would hum, and Ellie Harper would keep planting on her land, in her soul, and in the hearts of every person who crossed her path. Because kindness, real kindness, never stops growing. It only waits for the right season to bloom. And in our darkest moments, it still finds a way quietly, insistently, beautifully. Not everyone who helps seeks recognition. Some just want to know that tonight, someone is warm, someone is fed, someone feels seen. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. You may forget the story, but if no one tells it, it disappears.